The trading post sat at the crossroads of the frontier where dusty trails met wagon ruts, where cowboys watered their horses, and where townsfolk exchanged gossip as easily as grain and leather. It was a place overflowing with noise and stories. Yet one story remained unseen, pushed to the edges like a shadow no one cared to acknowledge. On the weather-beaten bench beside the trading post porch sat an old woman whom everyone simply called that drifter. Wrapped in a faded, patch-patch shawl and a wide-brimmed hat that had lost its shape long ago, she blended into the background, so completely that most people barely realized she was there. Some days she sat knitting with worn needles. Other days she simply rested her hands in her lap and stared toward the distant blue mountains. The way she watched the horizon, with a stillness that seemed years deep, unsettled some and bored others. No one bothered to wonder why. Within the bustle of the trading post, judgments moved faster than wagons. The shopkeeper assumed she was poor but harmless. The ranch wives whispered that she must be odd, maybe touched in the head. The cowhands, passing through, said she smelled like sagebrush and river dust, like someone who had lived too long alone. A few children, emboldened by curiosity, once asked who she was, but their questions were shrugged off, and eventually they stopped asking. In a frontier town where everyone valued hard work, youth, and strength, an old woman without a family, ranch, or wagon became invisible. Whenever she walked inside to buy a few necessities, usually just a tin of tea or a strip of jerky, conversations dipped, but not in concern. She was simply an interruption, something to ignore until she stepped back outside and returned to her usual place. What no one knew was that the old woman had arrived months earlier, limping slightly, carrying nothing but a weathered satchel with brass clasps and the stubborn look of someone who had crossed deserts and remembered every mile. Her boots were old but polished, her steps slow but steady. She never asked for charity, never joined anyone's table, never shared her story. That silence became the space people filled with their own assumptions. Rumors grew in her absence of explanation. Some said she waited for a son who would never return. Others believed she was a widow scraping by on memories. A few declared she had no business lingering around ranch country unless she was hiding something. But despite all the speculation, no one dared to sit beside her and simply speak to her, not out of fear, but because they assumed she had nothing to offer. Yet the truth, her truth, lived quietly beneath her stillness. When wagons thundered past too fast, she flinched with the instinct of someone who once rode hard themselves. When men argued over cattle prices, her eyes sharpened in recognition of strategies and half-truths. When the sheriff wandered by, she shifted ever so slightly, studying him with a knowledge that made her expression tighten. None of this was noticed. People rarely paid attention to those they had already decided did not matter, but on certain evenings, when the wind carried the scent of pine from the mountains, the old woman's gaze grew fierce, as though she were watching for a signal only she expected. There was purpose in her waiting, though the town remained blind to it. They simply saw an old soul marking time, a relic. A nobody on a porch. They had no idea she was far more than she appeared, and it stayed that way until the day a poor ranch hand stepped into town, glanced her way, and paused. Not in judgment, but in recognition of something others had long forgotten, that every person has a story, and some stories can change everything. Elias Carter rode into town on a tired sorrel mare whose ribs showed through her coat. Dust clung to his hat, his boots, and even the creases of his hands, a map of every mile he had traveled in search of work. He was young, perhaps 22, but the world had already carved worry into his brow. Life had a way of teaching some people early, and Elias had learned too much, too fast. He had grown up the eldest of 5, and when his parents died during a harsh winter, responsibility fell squarely on his shoulders. With no land to keep and no inheritance to claim, he drifted from ranch to ranch across the frontier. Every penny he earned went to feed and shelter his younger siblings, who were living with a distant aunt barely able to provide for herself. Elias often went hungry so they would not. He slept in barns, stables, or out under the stars all while, dreaming of a day when he could finally give his family a real home. By the time he reached the trading post, he had exhausted nearly all his savings. His mare could barely carry her own weight, let alone his. Still, Elias carried himself with quiet dignity. He wasn't ashamed of his poverty, he had survived worse. What weighed on him most was the feeling of being unseen. To most ranch owners, he was just another nameless, desperate hand looking for work. To travelers, he was another dusty face in the crowd. Elias had grown used to being overlooked, so much so that he hardly expected kindness from anyone anymore. When he dismounted near the trading post, he noticed the familiar rhythm of a community that did not have space for men like him. The wealthier ranchers gathered with pride. The shopkeeper stood busy but cheerful. Cowboys laughed loudly as they exchanged tall tailies. Everyone had a place. Elias did not. He walked his mare to the water trough and brushed the dirt from her coat, whispering promises that they'd soon find a stretch of work to keep them both fed. It was then he saw her, the old woman, sitting alone on the porch bench. She was wrapped in a faded shawl, her hands resting quietly in her lap. People walked past her as though she were another piece of worn furniture, something expected but unimportant. At first, Elias only glanced at her. But the second time his eyes passed over her, something tugged at his chest. There was a tiredness in her posture he recognized, a festa, weary patience that belonged to someone who had been ignored for far too long. He didn't approach her immediately. Instead, he tied off his horse and stepped inside the trading post to buy a bit of hay and a small loaf of bread, half of which he saved for his mare. When he stepped back out, he noticed the wind had picked up. The woman's thin shawl fluttered in the cold breeze, but she didn't huddle into it. She simply sat there, staring at nothing in particular. Without thinking much of it, Elias walked toward her. "You need a bit of warmth?" he asked gently, offering her his extra tin cup filled with hot water the shopkeeper had allowed him to take. She looked up, startled. Her pale eyes narrowed in confusion, almost suspicion, as though she couldn't quite understand why someone like him would bother speaking to her. "No one's asked me that in a long time," she murmured. Elias shrugged. "Cold wind don't care how old or young a person is." For the first time in weeks, maybe months, the old woman smiled. It was faint, timid, but real. In that simple exchange, something shifted. Elias didn't know it yet, but he had just stepped into a story far bigger than himself, one the town had ignored, but one that would soon change everything. In the days that followed, Elias found himself drawn back to the old woman's quiet corner of the trading post. Each morning, after feeding his mare and scrounging for work, he would pause on the porch and offer a nod, a word, or a small gift of bread or dried fruit. Slowly, a fragile trust began to grow between them, though neither spoke of the past. There was an unspoken understanding. Both had endured hardship, both had been overlooked, both had survived by grit and patience. It was on a late afternoon, while the sun poured gold across the town, that the old woman finally spoke in a way that startled Elias. She pointed toward a nearby fence post on a ranch across the road, a post he had passed countless times without noticing. Carved into the wood were faint symbols, a triangle with a slash through it, nearly invisible beneath years of sun-bleached paint. "Do you see that mark?" she asked. Her voice was low, urgent, yet steady. "Remember it. It is a warning." Elias squinted at the symbol. I think I've seen it before. On one of the ranches where I worked last month." His pulse quickened. "But it's just some prank, isn't it? Or a sign someone's selling cattle illegally?" The old woman shook her head. It is neither prank nor idle threat. Those marks are left by men who have terrorized these valleys before. They return. They always return. Elias frowned, trying to understand. He had heard of outlaw gangs, tales of masked raiders, and swift vengeance. But this was not a story or legend. It was here now, in the symbols etched into the fences, the silent warnings of danger approaching. Still, he hesitated. "But why are you telling me? Why not warn the town?" The old woman's eyes darkened. "I have tried. I spoke to the sheriff, to the shopkeeper, to those cowhands who pass through this trading post. No one listens. They see an old woman and hear only what they wish. Nonsense, old fears, madness. Only someone who has nothing to lose and everything to gain by paying attention can help now." Elias swallowed hard. Her words struck a chord deep in him. He had been invisible so often, ignored and dismissed. And yet, now this woman, this mysterious frail figure, was relying on him to notice what no one else would. It was a weight he hadn't expected to carry, yet somehow he accepted it instinctively. Over the next few days, Elias began to watch, to notice the subtleties she pointed out. Footprints in the dust that didn't match local cattle, the faint glimmer of a horse's bridle at twilight, and most alarming, more markings on fences across the valley carved with the same symbol. Each one told a story he had never been taught to read. Each one signaled danger inching closer to the town and its ranches. Despite the old woman's warnings, the townsfolk remained dismissive. A few chuckled when Elias mentioned the markings, suggesting he was imagining threats where none existed. Even some of the ranchers, busy with chores and livestock, waved off his concern. But Elias could not shake the sense of urgency he felt each time he glanced at her lined, weathered face. She had the eyes of someone who had survived unimaginable trials, who had seen the worst humanity could offer and yet still endured. Her quiet authority, the kind that comes not from power, but from experience, imprinted itself on him. He realized with a mix of fear and determination that she was testing him, watching to see if he could rise above indifference and heed warnings others ignored. And in doing so, she was preparing him for something larger, something dangerous. He didn't yet know the full story, the identity she had hidden so carefully, or the threat closing in, but for the first time in his life, Elias felt a purpose beyond mere survival. Somewhere between the symbols carved into fences and the old woman's steady gaze, a quiet truth became clear. Danger was near, and the town's safety might fall into the hands of the one person no one had ever noticed, and the young ranch hand who had finally stopped to look. The storm had arrived suddenly, as storms often do, in the frontier, dark clouds rolling across the mountains, lightning tearing the sky in jagged white streaks, and rain pounding the roofs of the trading post and surrounding ranches. Elias had tied his Mari in the small stable behind the post, but sleep was impossible. Something in the old woman's warnings gnawed at him, a tension that would not allow rest. He paced the porch, the wind whipping his coat around him, and noticed her sitting as usual, though the rain had begun to soak her shawl. "You should be inside," Elias called, his voice nearly lost to the roar of the storm. He ran toward her, but before he could reach her side, two men emerged from the shadows, rough, broad-shouldered figures cloaked in wet leather, faces hidden beneath low hats. Their gait was deliberate, predatory. They flanked her, cutting off her escape. Elias froze, fear and adrenaline flooding his veins. The men exchanged brief words, but what sent a chill down his spine was the way they addressed her. Marshal. The single word, whispered with both fear and contempt, made Elias stop mid-step. Marshal? He had assumed the old woman was frail, perhaps feeble. And yet, this single word carried weight, respect, history, power. The two men were not threatening a powerless drifter. They were challenging a legend. Without thinking, Elias ran. He shouted, his voice cutting through the storm, "Hey, leave her alone." The men turned toward him, briefly startled, but the moment passed. They lunged toward her. Elias grabbed a heavy stick from the porch and held his ground, heart hammering. "Get back," he shouted. "Or, I swear." The old woman moved faster than Elias could process. In one fluid motion, she twisted free of one man's grasp, her hand striking with precision he could barely follow. She moved like someone half her age, her stance low and steady, eyes blazing with a calm fury that froze him in awe. The men hesitated, the weight of recognition flickering in their eyes. They had faced her before, long ago, and they remembered. Elias felt a surge of realization. She wasn't just any old woman. She was someone who had survived battles, outlaws, and violence that had shaped the valley's history. He saw it in her stance, in her hands, in the calm confidence with which she met danger. "They won't stop," she said quietly, her voice carrying over the wind. "They've waited too long. They've come back for vengeance." Elias swallowed, trembling. "Who are they? And who are you?" The old woman's eyes softened for the first time. She stepped closer to him, still cautious but resolute. "I was a marshal long ago," she admitted. "I brought justice to this valley when it was lawless, when men like these ruled with fear. They call me that name because they fear me, though they hoped I was gone. I am still here, and they are back." The revelation crashed over Elias like a flood. All the signs, all the warnings, all the symbols etched into fences, they weren't idle threats. They were messages left by men who had terrorized the valley and now sought revenge. And she had been standing guard, unseen, underestimated by a town too small-minded to recognize her true identity. Elias looked at her, determination replacing fear. "Then I'll help," he said. "Tell me what to do. I'll watch, I'll fight, I'll whatever you need." For the first time, the old woman allowed a faint smile. "Good. You have the eyes of someone who can see what others ignore, and the courage to act when most would hesitate. You may be poor, but you have something far more valuable, Hart. Together, we might just stop them before it's too late." The storm raged around them, the valley trembling beneath the sheets of rain, yet amidst the chaos, a partnership was born. Elias, once ignored and overlooked, now stood beside a legend. And in the flash of lightning that split the sky, he realized the life he had known drifting, unnoticed, powerless, was over. The night had revealed the truth, and the journey ahead would demand bravery neither of them had yet measured. The storm had passed, leaving the valley damp and glistening, yet the tension it had stirred lingered. Elias walked beside the old woman through the muddy trails behind the trading post, each step measured and quiet. He was no longer just a young ranch hand drifting from job to job. He was an apprentice, a partner in a dangerous game he barely understood. And the old marshal, once invisible to the town, had become both his guide and mentor. Over the following days, they moved from ranch to ranch, observing the signs that only she seemed to notice, the broken branches along hidden trails, hoof prints that did not match any known horses in the area, and the subtle shift of guard dogs, uneasy when strangers approached. Each clue she pointed out carried a weight of history and experience. Her eyes, sharp and discerning, missed nothing, and her instructions were precise. Elias soaked in every word, every lesson, as though the very life of the town depended on it, and it did. She trained him in ways that were not just physical. She taught him to read subtle signals in the landscape, to understand behavior as instinctively as she did. When they discovered a fence post carved with the same ominous symbol, she showed him how to trace the pattern, revealing what it meant: a specific target, a warning, a threat. Elias began to realize the scale of the danger. This was not a small group of petty thieves. It was a gang with a personal vendetta, men who remembered her and wanted to reclaim power over the valley by destroying anyone who had once defied them. Meanwhile, the gang's return was not a secret to them alone. Through cautious observation, the old marshal and Elias discovered that the outlaws had been probing the area, testing defenses, and watching the townsfolk. The sheriff dismissed them as harmless wanderers, and the ranchers paid little attention, assuming the old woman's warnings were either exaggerated or crazy. Only Elias took her seriously, because he had seen what fear and courage looked like up close, and he knew, in his gut, that ignoring her would be catastrophic. As the days passed, Elias began to feel a profound change within himself. Where he had once carried only the weight of his family's survival, he now carried responsibility for the lives of strangers as well. He saw courage in himself he had not known existed, and the old marshal noticed it too. "You have heart, Elias," she said one evening as they cleaned their modest campsite by the creek. "It is one thing to survive. It is another to act when survival is not enough. That is what this fight requires." Together they devised a plan. They would use the knowledge of the valley, the hidden trails, and the symbols carved into fences to anticipate the gang's moves. Elias learned to set discreet alarms, mark escape routes, and hide supplies in places that would later seem ordinary to anyone unaware of them. Every small victory built his confidence, but it also built tension. The gang would not wait forever, and they were getting closer. Then, one night, Elias spotted smoke in the distance, a signal fire meant to communicate between the outlaws. Heart racing, he rushed to the old marshal. She studied the fire, her expression unreadable. "They've begun," she said quietly, "and they will not stop until we face them." Elias realized with a mix of fear and determination that the valley's peace was hanging by a thread. He no longer feared the old woman's past. It was her strength, her skill, and her experience that guided him. But he did fear the coming confrontation and the lives at stake. Yet beneath the fear, there was also a newfound resolve. He had seen the world's indifference, its cruelty, and its dangers. And now, armed with her guidance, he understood what it meant to fight for something bigger than oneself. In the quiet before dawn, the old marshal and Elias prepared to gather tools, traps, and strategies laid out with meticulous care. The past had returned, yes, but so had their courage. The coming battle would test them both, but for the first time, Elias felt certain of one thing. No one in the valley would underestimate them again. The valley lay shrouded in early morning mist, the faint pink of dawn brushing the mountain peaks, but there was no peace in the air. Elias and the old marshal stood at the trading post, their eyes scanning every shadow, every movement along the nearby trails. Every sense was alert. The gang of outlaws they had been tracking for weeks had finally made their move, emboldened by the assumption that the old woman was powerless and that the young ranch hand was inexperienced. They were about to learn the truth. The first sign of their approach was subtle. A hoofbeat muffled by the fog, a faint scrape of metal on wood. Elias's pulse quickened, but he remembered her teachings, the patience, the observation, the timing. The old marshal, standing tall despite her years, directed him with calm precision. Wait for the right moment. Do not act out of fear. Observe, then strike. When the gang finally revealed themselves, a small group of men, their leader tall and cruel, faces twisted in anticipation of revenge, they underestimated the pair completely. The old marshal's knowledge of the land and the gang's past movements gave them a decisive advantage. Elias, once timid and overlooked, now moved with purpose, blocking trails, herding the outlaws into positions where their numbers counted for nothing. The young ranch hand's strength and courage surprised even him. The confrontation was swift and precise. The old marshal moved like a shadow, striking with authority born of years of experience. Elias followed her instructions, setting traps, creating distractions, and cutting off escape routes. The gang's leader attempted to rally his men, but the duo's coordinated efforts left them trapped and exposed. The fight was tense, with moments of near disaster, but each time, Elias relied on the old marshal's guidance and his own instincts, sharpened through weeks of preparation. When the dust settled, the gang lay subdued, captured by the sheriff who had finally arrived, drawn by the commotion. The outlaws were defeated not just by strength, but by strategy, knowledge, and courage. The town, witnessing the aftermath, could no longer dismiss the old woman as a harmless relic or a deluded old lady. She had been a marshal, a guardian of the valley whose quiet vigilance had prevented disaster. And the young ranch hand who had finally seen her worth stood beside her, transformed from an invisible drifter into a hero in his own right. The town's respect was slow to manifest but undeniable. Neighbors approached with gratitude, shaking hands, offering apologies for their indifference. The old marshal accepted quietly, her satisfaction not in recognition, but in the safety she had restored. She had reclaimed her place not through confrontation alone, but by teaching a new generation what courage and integrity truly meant. Elias, who had known little beyond struggle and survival, found a new sense of purpose. He was offered steady work at a local ranch, a chance to save enough to finally care for his siblings properly, and, more importantly, a sense of belonging. But the true reward lay in the bond he had formed with the old marshal, a partnership forged in trust, danger, and mutual respect. They had each stepped into a story the town ignored, and together they had changed its course in the quiet evenings. After the storm, the trading post porch returned to its peaceful rhythm. But now, instead of invisibility, there was presence. Children lingered to listen to stories. Adults paused to speak, and the old marshal watched over the valley with calm vigilance. Elias sat beside her, learning, sharing, and finally understanding the power of paying attention when others do not. The lesson was clear. Sometimes the most overlooked people carry the deepest knowledge, the most unwavering courage, and the capacity to change everything. And sometimes it takes someone willing to see them, someone willing to act with kindness and courage to reveal the truth. Together, the old woman and the young ranch hand had done just that, proving that respect, recognition, and bravery are earned not by age or wealth, but by heart, action, and the willingness to step forward when the world looks away.